I still remember the exact moment my life shifted, even though at the time it felt like just another lawn to mow. I was standing behind my old second-hand mower, sweat already soaking through my shirt, when she smiled at me and said, "Careful, I get attached to hard workers." I laughed it off back then, but those words stayed with me longer than I ever expected. My name is Alex. I am 24 years old, and I live in a small town just outside Columbus, Ohio. I have always been the kind of guy who liked working with his hands. While most of my friends went to college or sat behind desks all day, I spent 5 years saving every dollar I could and learning everything about landscaping. I had one simple dream. I wanted to build my own lawn care business from nothing. A few months ago, I finally did it. It was not impressive to look at. I drove an old white Ford van that rattled every time I turned the key. My mower was secondhand and fixed up by me in my garage. My trimmers were scratched, and my leaf blower was the cheapest one I could afford. But everything worked, and that was enough. I named my business Green Line Yard Services and printed my own flyers at home. At first, I barely had any clients. Family members, a couple of neighbors, and friends of friends. Most of the time I worked for free or for whatever they could pay. I was not really making money, but I kept telling myself to stay patient. I believed that if I treated every yard like it mattered, people would notice. One afternoon, I was sitting at my small desk at home, staring at my tools, and wondering if I had made a mistake chasing this dream. That is when my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize, I answered, trying to sound professional. A soft but confident voice spoke on the other end. She said her neighbor had given her my number and that she was looking for someone to take care of her lawn. I told her I was available and could come by the next day. When she gave me the address, my heart started racing. This felt different. This felt like my first real chance. The next morning, I loaded my equipment into the van and drove over. When I pulled up, I almost did not believe it. The house was large and beautiful, sitting in one of the nicest neighborhoods I had ever worked in. Everything looked neat and expensive. This was not a small favor job. This was the kind of place where people expected perfection. I rang the doorbell and waited. When the door opened, I froze for a second. She looked like she was in her early 40s, tall and confident, dressed casually but with clear taste. Her dark hair was pulled back, and she smiled like she already trusted me. She introduced herself as Rachel and told me to call her by her name, not ma'am. She walked me around the property, pointing out what she wanted done. She explained that her last landscaper had stopped showing up, and she liked things clean and orderly. I nodded and listened carefully. I promised her I would take care of it. I started working right away. The sun was hot, and sweat ran down my back within minutes. My mower sputtered at first, but it held up. I focused on clean lines, neat edges, and details most people ignored. I even pulled a few weeds along the path without being asked. At one point, I looked up and noticed Rachel standing on the porch watching me. I felt awkward and waved before getting back to work. About an hour later, she walked over as I finished the last strip of grass. I turned off the mower and wiped my forehead. She looked at the lawn and smiled. She said it looked amazing and that I really cared about details. I told her I treated every yard like it was my own. That is when she tilted her head, smiled, and said those words, "Careful. I get attached to hard workers." I laughed, not sure if she was joking. She smiled warmly and told me she would pay me online and call me again soon. I packed up my tools and drove away, feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Hope. 3 days passed. I kept grinding, taking small jobs wherever I could find them. I checked my phone constantly, hoping it would ring. Then one morning, it did. It was Rachel again. She asked if I could come back to trim the hedges because no one ever seemed to do them right. As I hung up, I stared at my phone and smiled. It was not just a one-time job anymore. I did not know it then, but that call was only the beginning of something that would change everything for me. I pulled back into Rachel's driveway that same afternoon, feeling more confident than the first time but still wanting to impress her. The hedges along the front of the house were tall and uneven, clearly ignored for a while. I grabbed my trimmers, took a deep breath, and got to work without wasting time. The sun was beating down harder than before, and the hedges were thick and stubborn. I focused on shaping them cleanly, stepping back every few minutes to make sure the lines were straight. I was so locked into the work that I barely noticed Rachel nearby until she spoke. She said I really was meticulous. I smiled and told her that attention to detail was everything in my business. She nodded like she appreciated that answer. We talked lightly while I worked. Nothing deep, just small talk about the neighborhood and how unreliable the previous landscaper had been. Still, something about the way she talked to me felt easy, natural. When I finished the last hedge, she looked genuinely impressed. She thanked me and said everything looked better than she imagined. I felt proud, not just because of the compliment, but because I knew I had earned it. Then she surprised me. She hesitated for a second before saying she had made too much food for dinner and asked if I would like to stay and eat as a thank you. That kind of invitation was not something I was used to. Clients usually handed me payment and closed the door. I told her I did not want to impose, but she waved it off and said it was just dinner. Something about her calm tone made me relax. I agreed. I packed up my tools and followed her inside. Her house was beautiful, but not cold or flashy. It felt warm and lived in. Large windows let in soft light, and everything was clean without feeling stiff. The kitchen smelled incredible. We sat down at the table, and the food tasted even better than it smelled. We talked easily. She asked about my business, how I started, and what I wanted to do with it. I told her the truth. I was barely breaking even. Most of my equipment was old. I dreamed of having a real crew one day and a proper truck with my logo on it. She listened carefully and told me I had drive. I shrugged, a little embarrassed, and said I was just trying to build something for myself. After dinner, she offered me wine. I declined because I had to drive, and she nodded, saying she respected that. We kept talking, and the conversation never felt forced. It was strange how comfortable it felt sitting there with her. As the sun started to set, I thanked her and stood up to leave. She walked me to the door and joked that she would probably find more things around the house for me to fix. I told her I looked forward to it. Driving home that night, I kept replaying the day in my head. It felt surreal. I did not know what it meant, but I had a feeling something important had started. The next week was busy. Rachel recommended me to a few neighbors, and suddenly my phone started ringing more. I was exhausted but grateful. Then on Friday afternoon, Rachel called again and asked if I was free the next day. Her backyard garden was overgrown, and she wanted me to help. I agreed right away. The next morning, I arrived to find her standing on the front steps, smiling and waving. She was dressed simply, but everything about her seemed effortlessly put together. She walked me around to the backyard and showed me what needed to be done. It was a big job, but I did not mind. I worked for hours. I trimmed shrubs, pulled weeds, shaped flower beds, and cleared the stone paths. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and my arms burned, but I kept going. Every so often, Rachel came outside to offer me iced tea. I finally accepted and sat on the steps for a short break. She sat beside me and said she admired how dedicated I was. I told her my business carried my name, and I wanted people to remember me for good work. She smiled and said I was doing exactly that. By early evening, the backyard looked completely different. Rachel looked at it and smiled wide, clearly happy. She thanked me again and then asked if I would stay for dinner. This time, I did not hesitate as long. I said yes. Inside, the house felt even warmer in the evening light. Soft music played in the background. We talked more deeply this time. I told her about my childhood, how my dad taught me to fix things, and how I always wanted to build something of my own. She listened closely, like my story mattered. She told me I was brave for taking the risk. I laughed and said it might just be stubbornness. When it got late, I stood up to leave. At the door, she lightly rested her hand on my arm and said I would be hearing from her again. My heart started beating faster, and I was not sure why. As I drove home that night, I realized that working for Rachel no longer felt like just another job. Something was changing, and I could feel it, even if I did not yet understand what it meant. The weeks that followed slipped into a strange kind of rhythm. My days were longer than ever, starting before sunrise and ending when my arms felt like they might fall off. I took every job I could get. Mowing, trimming, edging, pulling weeds by hand when I had to. My body was tired, but my mind felt focused. For the first time, my business felt real. And every time Rachel called, I made space for her. Not just because she paid well, but because being at her place felt different, calmer. Every visit started the same way. She would open the door with that familiar warm smile and ask how business was going. Somehow, those few minutes of conversation made the hard work feel lighter. One afternoon, near the end of summer, she called again. This time, she said her patio needed a serious power wash. The last person she hired had rushed the job, and she wanted it done right. I told her I would be there the next day. The sun was brutal when I arrived. I dragged the heavy rented power washer across the stone patio, already sweating. Rachel stepped outside with 2 cold bottles of water and handed me one. She joked that I was going to melt out there. I smiled and told her I had handled worse. She stayed nearby while I worked, leaning against the railing, watching quietly. Our conversations were still light, but something had shifted. Small looks, longer pauses, a kind of comfort that did not need constant words. She told me she had never seen anyone put so much care into her yard. I told her I was building something and every job mattered. She went quiet for a moment and then said it showed. When I finished, the patio looked brand new. I packed up my equipment, tired but proud. She walked across the clean stone and smiled. Then she asked if I wanted to come inside for a bit. Inside, she poured herself a glass of wine. I grabbed water from the fridge. We talked about life. She told me she had been married years ago, but she had been on her own for a long time now. There was no sadness in her voice, just honesty. I told her about my parents, about growing up watching my dad fix everything instead of replacing it, about how I dreamed of owning my own place someday. She listened closely and told me she believed I would get there. As I stood to leave, she stopped me at the door. She looked directly at me and said she had been thinking. Then she said something I never expected. She told me she was considering investing in my business. She said she believed in me and wanted to help. I froze. No one had ever offered me anything like that before. My first reaction was to say no. I told her it was too generous and that I did not know if I could accept something like that. She smiled gently and told me I did not have to decide right away. I drove home that night in silence. My hands shook slightly on the steering wheel. That offer sat heavy in my chest. Part of me wanted to refuse. I had built this business from nothing. But another part of me knew this could change everything. The next few days were restless. I barely slept. My thoughts bounced between pride and possibility. By the middle of the week, I knew I had to talk to her. I called and asked if I could stop by. She said, "Of course." When I arrived, she welcomed me inside like always. We sat at the kitchen table. I told her how grateful I was and how much her belief meant to me. Then I told her I would accept her offer, but only as a loan. I said I would pay back every dollar, with interest. She smiled and said she respected that. We shook hands across the table. That moment felt important, not romantic, not strictly business, something built on trust. The weeks that followed changed my life, fast. She wired the funds, and I immediately upgraded everything. A newer van with my logo, better equipment, even my first part-time employee. Suddenly, I could take on bigger jobs. Word spread fast. By the end of the season, I was booked weeks in advance. I was no longer just getting by, I was building something real. Rachel remained my client. Sometimes after work, we would sit on her patio, sipping iced tea, watching the sun go down over the yard I had shaped with my own hands. Everything felt balanced. Until one quiet evening, she said something that made me realize this chapter was not finished yet. That quiet evening stayed with me longer than I expected. Rachel did not say anything dramatic. She just sat there beside me on the patio, looking out at the yard, and said how proud she was of what I had built. Not proud in a casual way, but in a way that felt real, like my success mattered to her. From that point on, life moved fast. My business kept growing. I hired another part-time worker. Then another. I upgraded my tools again, took on bigger contracts, and finally felt like I was running a real company, not just surviving week to week. My days were long and exhausting, but they felt worth it. Every invoice paid, every new client signed, felt like proof that I had made the right choice. Through all of it, Rachel stayed steady in my life. She never pushed, never crossed any lines. She stayed my client, my supporter, and someone I genuinely respected. After jobs, we still sat together sometimes, talking about work, about life, about small things that somehow felt important. I kept my promise to her. Every month, I paid back part of the loan. I tracked every dollar carefully. She never reminded me or asked about the money. In fact, she often told me to slow down and focus on growing first. But paying her back mattered to me. It was about pride. By the end of the year, I had paid back a large portion of what she had given me. My business was stable, strong. I even started looking at houses, something I never thought I would be able to do at my age. One afternoon, after finishing yet another job at her place, I packed up my equipment like I had done dozens of times before. Rachel walked over, smiling as she looked at the lawn. "You really did it, Alex," she said. There was pride in her voice. I told her I could not have done it without her. She shook her head and said I would have found a way, with or without help. She said all she did was give me a push at the right moment. We stood there quietly for a second. I told her that after this season, I would probably not be able to do her lawn personally as often. My crew would handle most of it. The business had reached that point. I waited for her reaction. She smiled and said she understood. Then she joked that she would still call me if something really needed to be done right. We shook hands, like we always did. But this time felt different, like the end of a chapter. Driving away that day, I realized how much had changed since that first job. I was no longer the kid with a rattling van and a fixed-up mower. I was a business owner, someone people trusted, someone who had built something real with his own hands. Rachel stayed in my life, just not in the way people might expect. We never turned it into a romance. There were no dramatic confessions or complicated moments. What we had was something quieter and deeper. Mutual respect, gratitude, trust. Looking back now, I understand something important. Not every meaningful connection has to turn into a love story. Some people come into your life to help you believe in yourself, to see your potential before you do, to give you the courage to keep going when things feel impossible. Rachel was that person for me, and every time I see a perfectly cut lawn or hear my company name spoken with respect, I remember the day I was mowing her yard when she smiled and warned me that she got attached to hard workers. She was right, but not in the way I first thought.